ladies and gentlemen, it's time to move to our plenary sessions for the afternoon. And our first one, we're going to take a look at mining. And imagine the mining of the future, operated by driverless vehicles and drones and robots, extracting those incredibly valuable minerals deeper from within the earth than we've ever witnessed before. So to discuss digital transformation in mining, and before we do that, we'd also like to welcome to the auditorium the Deputy Premier, John Rao, who has a plethora of titles, but we welcome him. Welcome, John, who's also South Australia's Attorney-General, the Minister for Planning, the Minister for Industrial Relations, the Minister for Consumer and Business Affairs, and the Minister for the City of Adelaide. And you'll excuse me, Minister, I probably left off a few portfolios, but time's of the essence, so thank you so much. So to move forward with our discussion on the digital transformation in mining, would you please welcome to the stage Mr. Aaron Loeffler, the Natural Resources Senior Business Consultant with Dassault Systèmes, and our invited speakers today, Mr. Gavin Yates, Mining Futurist and Director of the Australasian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy, and Ms. Michelle Ash, Chief Innovation Officer from Barrick Gold, who will actually be dialing in from Canada. And as they make their way to the stage, I just do have a footnote. We do have a relatively tight timetable today, and in an effort to keep our speakers on track, we will have a very subtle 5-minute reminder to let them know that they're coming close to the end of their discussion. Without any further ado, I'll now hand over to Aaron. Please make our panel welcome.
Here. Well, thanks, Lou, and you don't have to be very subtle about the 5-minute reminder because this conversation could go for some time. I have Gavin Yates with me. I have worked with Gavin before, so it's a pleasure to have him on stage. And we do have Michelle Ash. Is Michelle available? Here she is. She's joining us from Vancouver, I believe.
Toronto, actually,
Toronto.
Aaron.
Toronto, that's even worse. What's the time? What is the time over there?
It is nearly 11 p.m.
Well, we thank you for your commitment. Look, we'll get straight into it. The Sox mentioned at the start that mining was one of those industries when he took over that was in a downturn. And one of the key things about what was happening in mining is they'd come off a very, very long upswing in the industry where they could make advances essentially disregarding any costs. When commodity prices tanked, they discovered that some of the measures that they had put in over the previous 20 years were perhaps not consistent with a way to make money. So this has put a lot of pressure on mining companies, and one of the things that they found they really needed to do was to digitally transform their mines. So that's what we're here to talk about today, and I thank everyone for attending, and I've got a few pointed questions to ask our panellists, but it is a conversation, so we might not follow script. So I'll start just by asking you, Gavin, what is it that you see is the digital imperative for mining companies at the moment?
I guess we've seen, as you mentioned, the cost pressures driven by the price cycle, but behind that there's actually a imperative that is often not seen, and it's the decline in grade of our existing ore bodies. We're not actually finding many new ore bodies to replace what we've been mining, and all our mines are either getting lower grade, deeper, more complex, so it's all getting harder. So the margin is squeezing, and we're having to move into new mineral space. I guess the boom was primarily around China and infrastructure, so it was iron ore driven. We're now seeing copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium driving the next cycle in the economy.
Are you seeing the same, Michelle, or do you have a different point of view on that? It's quite a broad subject.
Yeah, look, so I don't disagree. I think things technically are getting harder. mines are getting lower grade, etc. I think, though, there's a number of external factors as well. What we're seeing are things like, communities are having greater demands in terms of our environmental impact. A number of our jurisdictions, we're starting to see millennials taking the majority of the vote, somewhere between 2018 and 2020. And they certainly have different expectations, as do communities on mining companies. And I think there's also a rapid change in technology, which makes it harder for us to continue doing things the same. So really the imperative to change is both internal, in terms of part of what mining and mining companies are doing, but also external, in terms of communities, technology, and in fact our own people with greater demands for productivity, for ease of use of technology.
That's good. So in terms of implementing those sorts of digital transformations that they need to implement, what are the main hurdles that have really prevented mining companies from doing that already?
I guess from what I see, the hurdles is primarily a people issue. The technologies are there, and to some extent we're already seeing that play out. Australia is leading the world in autonomous vehicles, for instance. There's roughly 200 autonomous trucks running around in the Pilbara today. All the fleet of blast hole drills are autonomous in the Pilbara. And they're being operated from remote operating centres. So the industry is well on the way, and taking people with them, re-engineering those jobs, and I guess the skill base is different. So, the rise of completely new careers for people that are focused around mechatronics, data analytics, data science, deep learning, AI, it goes on. But harnessing that in an environment where we still have to pump the cash out today and get the product to the customer today and build the foundation for the future, that's the challenge, and it's managing people through that change. And Michelle's absolutely right, the pressure from the external world and the rise of the millennials and the future workforce, they're all pressures, but they're people issues.
Very good. So Michelle, in terms of, both of you have spoken about people issues around mining, and I guess social pressures. How can mining companies manage that?
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in Michelle's response, but I think it's probably threefold. The first is transparency. I think the industry hasn't been as transparent as it could be, and I think to take the communities and stakeholders along, they need to be more transparent. And we're seeing some of that with publishing dust and noise and those sorts of things in real time. There's education, and I think it's education at all levels. I don't think the average high school student actually understands where the metal in their iPhone comes from. And I think the last piece is there's a technology piece to this that as we move from digitisation to digitalisation and reinvent mining, being able to visualise that in a virtual environment to take the stakeholders along is all part of that, and it is an experience. It's not it's not an old world industry anymore. It's very much, if you walk into one of the remote operating centres, you're in a 21st century mining operation.
Yeah, Michelle?
Yeah, look, so I don't disagree. I think some of the things that we've done at the Cortez mine in Nevada to try to overcome some of those issues of taking people with us has to use a more agile approach, break the problem down into bite-sized pieces. We call them minimum viable products. Get the developers actually working in the front line with the supervisors, the maintainers, the operators who are going to use the equipment. We've actually found that's a way to get very rapid adoption of a lot of this digital technology. But some of the stumbling blocks we've found are still things like, you know, educating all levels, you know, whether that be the board, the management team, the managers, general managers, even analysts, in terms of what can we really expect, how fast can we move, what will these technologies actually do and drive. And sometimes as simple as how are they actually going to change people's roles. You know, one of the difficulties we had at one point was when we implemented some of the tools directly to the operators, they were getting information and able to solve problems rapidly. And the supervisors then weren't sure what their role was anymore, because previously they had been the conduits through which information and problems were solved. So I think there's also a process of redesigning roles and processes to allow the technology to really drive the productivity and the enhancements that we want. The other one I would add, my sort of, is how do we work through a process company, you know, any even segment or industry can't work on these problems alone. Some of them are too vast and too, you know, have multi-facets to them. So I think it's absolutely important that we work collaboratively, whether it be with, you know, universities, with governments, with other sectors, and with other mining companies to solve these problems more rapidly.
All right, well, that raises the question, I guess, all these initiatives that are being implemented into the mines in what really needs to be a dynamically changing environment as processes are being re-engineered. How can mines measure the success of the initiatives that they're putting in place?
I guess there's leading and lag indicators. Ultimately, it's value. It's got to be value driven, but it's also really simple stuff like a lot of the initiatives around technology are going to fundamentally reduce fatalities, reduce injuries in the workplace, removing people from high energy environments. So pretty simply, they're fairly easy to measure. But as Michelle was talking about, some of the productivity areas, a little bit more difficult. And I think our tendency is to try and measure them too low down, and that drives a sort of silo thinking and optimising of pieces. I would be encouraging people to think about higher level measures around productivity and probably the sleeper in this is for the mining industry is capital intensity. One of the big areas I think that digital plays in is allowing us to make a step change in the amount of capital needed to add a tonne of capacity of production. So capital intensity is something the industry is struggling with.
Well, we've maybe lost Michelle for a little bit. No, there she's back.
Yeah, so look, I've got so similar views. I think at the end of the day, absolutely it's value. And certainly when we look at our innovation program, we want to contribute a certain amount of value within a particular time. And it might have slightly longer time periods if the technology is still advancing. But I think the others, in terms of fundamental changes and shifts in safety and health outcomes, fundamental changes in productivity outcomes, I absolutely agree on the capital intensity. The whole point of a lot of these technologies is to drive utilisation, get greater productivity from capital, and therefore have to engage less of it to extract minerals. The other two that I would add, though, one I think that's fundamentally important is energy intensity, and really drive our use of energy down. I think the other would be water intensity, and especially in some communities, whether it be in South America or in other parts of the world where water is scarce and people require that water. I think that's a really important aspect. And then the other one, I think, which is a shorter term one, which is, I think, if we adopt the same lessons as I've seen in other industries, whether it be manufacturing or technologies, is this whole issue around fail fast but fail cheaply, and make sure that we do that in a controlled manner. So, I think one of the learnings for mining is, in mining we often put in multi-billion-dollar or multi-million-dollar proof of concepts, and sometimes that can then become quite expensive to get to the end outcome. Whereas if we can do proof of concepts that are smaller, we move towards our end goal, and if it's not going to work, then we quickly pivot and try something different. I think we'll actually get to the outcome faster and certainly a lot cheaper.
That's good. Okay, so we're both talking about value and cost there, so that sort of leads into my next question, which is about the cost. And it's probably not, we understand undertaking these kinds of initiatives is generally fairly costly, but the question's more, what's the cost of mining companies not undertaking some kind of digital transformation?
Well, I think it's the cost of not doing it and the value you can create by doing it. It's sort of two sides of the coin. If you look at the cost of not doing it, I think as we talked about, grades declining, stakeholder expectations going up, you end up sliding down the cost curve or sliding up the cost curve so that you become less competitive. It is a competitive game, and there's a lot of structural things working against miners. So just to stand still, they've got to work harder. And if you don't invest in technology, and particularly make use of the data and digitalisation that's happening in the world, you will move up the cost curve.
Michelle, anything to add?
Yeah. So look, I absolutely agree with that. I think do nothing and we will slide up the cost curve. I think the other interesting thing is that we're starting to see a number of disruptors coming into the industry or doing aspects of what the industry does. So if you look at, Elon Musk companies such as Boring Company, he's certainly able to design and create tunnels, and his intention is to replicate some of that. You're starting to see SpaceX and Planetary Resources having a look at how they can extract minerals in very difficult situations. You've got Google looking at automation quite heavily. And, you've got Amazon wanting to really look at how they operate and manage logistics and warehousing businesses. I do think if we don't improve and don't do what we can to adopt technologies and really modernise our industry, we'll start seeing other companies able to do what we can do better, and therefore, take some of those places in our industry.
All right. Look, I think that's a very, very good summary. So I'm not sure how we're going for time. So I want to make sure we had an opportunity to take that pie in the sky question. I might start with you, Michelle. The future of mining. So going beyond 20 years, 50 years, go as far as you want. What do you think, as a collective, we're looking at this far into the future?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess I've spoken about this a few times, but I think my view is that certainly across most of the parts of the mining industry, we're going to have to start looking at much more precise extraction methodologies, really taking the metal and trying to leave most of the rest behind, drive much further towards carbon neutrality, towards full automation, start looking at even use of other technologies such as blockchain, which I think will transform, not only how we store information, how we create trust relationships, how a lot of our value chains work, and in some cases even look at whether you extract the minerals at all or whether we vault them in the ground and make use of them as a financial instrument there. But I think certainly some of the things that SpaceX and Planetary Resources and other companies like that are doing, where they're looking at extracting minerals in space and then actually supplying those minerals to those that are making use of space stations and other things off the Earth. I think that's actually really quite interesting, and potentially show how we may have to think about our resources here. And then I think one thing we haven't spoken about so much, which is I think the use of AR and VR, not only for our communities, for our governments, for our stakeholders, and for our own people in terms of how we interact and understand what we're doing in mining.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Gavin.
Yeah, I think Michelle's spot on with the trend towards specificity of extraction. At the moment, we extract an enormous amount of waste with whatever the good stuff is we take out. So the push to being very specific, which will be lower energy, so it'll be hydrometallurgical, it'll be nanobots, could be swarms of those, targeting just the valuable mineral. And Michelle, from a gold miner's perspective, absolutely the question of whether we actually need to extract gold at all only to put it back in a vault somewhere underground is a very real question. But for other minerals like that society needs to live in the next century, we're absolutely going to have to do that in a far more sustainable, less energy intensive, less water intensive, socially acceptable way than we currently do. So that in that there will be a lot more recycling. But I think the types of mines we'll have will be targeting the scale at which the ore body occurs, be fully automated, and potentially make use of new methods that are much lower in energy than we use today.
Just my own personal thing that I want to pick up on is that when I became a mining engineer, my dream of being an astronaut seemed so far away. But the future of mining means that it's not quite out of the question just yet. So that's music to my ears. The one that really interests me is the blockchain idea and leaving gold in the ground. But the part I've always struggled with that concept is that eventually somebody needs to be able to prove that it's actually there. So there's a lot of uncertainty in geological modelling.
Absolutely.
In terms of the future, how can we overcome that?
Yeah, well, and I think this is a real issue because you're right. You've got to actually prove that you own the gold in the first place. I think we are making enormous advances, and many of them here in South Australia around coming out of the deep exploration CRC and some of the work Bort Longyear are doing here with testing new ways of sensing in real time, drilling faster, gaining access to information about the ore body, and then modelling it, not modelling it in an old sense, but modelling it with the uncertainty. So we know what the uncertainty is and dealing with it as an uncertain estimate. And then if you are trying to invest in something, you're investing in it knowing the level of certainty you've got. And I think that's the place where the future is we're not going to try and know it for sure, but we're going to know it at a known uncertainty.
All right. Michelle?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think less important for blockchain and whether you leave gold in the ground, but more important for our industry is to find ore bodies faster, cheaper, and more completely. So to what Nathan said before, I mean, I think there has been some wonderful developments in, whether it be CT rigs or Labbit rig, which was both developed in Australia, and Bort Longyear and others are really sort of bringing that forward. But I think the other things we're really going to have to focus on are, better sensor technology so that we can try to detect, especially undercover. And I know there's a lot of work going on with that. We need to think through how can we improve geostatistics, especially now with improved artificial intelligence, not only what we have today, but what is being rapidly developed. Because I think that the idea of understanding our ore bodies more completely is fundamentally important to our industry. And then the ability to find ore bodies faster, I think, is also going to be important, because one of the difficulties we've had over the last 30 years, and people like Richard Shoddy have written about this a number of times, is that we haven't replaced the number of ounces that we have mined in a number of our commodities. I know coal, iron ore and bauxite, that's not true for, but zinc, copper, gold, etc. it is. So I think there's a dual challenge there. I mean, I think in terms of how blockchain may or may not work, the JORC guidelines already give us quite a good way of determining what is in the ground.
Okay, I've got a feeling we're coming close to the end. Yeah, so I'll just throw the floor open for any closing comments from either of you, because we're valuable to get your time.
Yeah, I guess the future's pretty bright, I think, for mining. The opportunity is huge. I think we've got to move from the sort of managing the pieces of the value chain to managing the whole of the value chain. We've got to make use of the data, and as Michelle mentioned, new sensors coming out all the time. How do we make use of that exploding data set that we're getting? But I would emphasise that it's got to be focused around value and solving the business problem, not technology looking for a home, rather than solving a real business problem and thinking at a level that is transformative, rather than let's just try and digitise what we're currently doing. Let's think of digitalising the whole value chain.
Very good. Michelle?
Yeah, so look, the only things I would emphasise beyond that is we really need to think about how we redesign the whole system rather than parts of the system, which I think is Nathan's point about the value chain. The toughest part is putting together the ecosystems that are going to help us solve these problems, whether that be a number of mining companies working together with some OEMs, with some technology providers. And then, I think the other challenge is for us to take technologies that are already being proven, and especially those in the retail industry. So, use of iPads, use of iPhones, Androids, other technology, rather than reinventing technology or having something that is special, I think is going to be important to our success. But I agree, I think there's a wonderful opportunity in the mining industry to really make a difference and change our industry over the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, look, I can't agree more. I think from my own perspective, mining hasn't come along the transformative path that other industries may have, and rather than trying to reblaze a path that's already been blazed by other industries, I think we can rely heavily on the blazing that they have done to really take advantage of that enormous upside that I think mining has. So I think our time has essentially come to an end, but I wanted to thank everyone for their attention, and special thanks to Gavin and Michelle for taking the time to come and talk to us today. And I hope that was a useful session for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.